Upton Sinclair's 1906 book, The Jungle, highlighted the challenges of immigrant meatpacking workers in Chicago. He was yet another muckraker, but he was no progressive. He was a socialist who wanted to show the country how Chicago's immigrant workers were being exploited. The book became a bestseller, drawing the attention of President Roosevelt himself. But he wasn't concerned with the state of the immigrant workers. He, along with the rest of the country, were concerned with the filthy conditions of the meatpacking plants described in the book. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had trampled and spit. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. This was the meat Americans were consuming. They were horrified. Sinclair knew of what he wrote, since he spent time in Chicago's meatpacking plants to research his book. Congress immediately drew up plans for a new meat inspection law that would require the government ensure the sanitary conditions of meatpacking plants. This was not the effect Sinclair was going for. In his words, "I aimed at the public's heart and hit them in the stomach." The meatpacking companies might have been embarrassed, but they didn't have a problem with government inspections. In fact, the government was already inspecting them. Believe it or not, meatpacking in America was even worse before 1891, which was when Congress passed the first law to regulate meat quality. European countries were horrified by the disgusting meat coming from the United States. They made laws ensuring American companies would not be able to sell meat there until they adopted minimum quality standards. The law in 1891 forced meatpacking companies to adopt those standards demanded by Europe. It ended up helping the meatpacking business by ensuring that they could still do business in Europe. But since then, new companies started entering the meatpacking industry. They were smaller companies and didn't have the resources to ensure their meat was always up to standard. Their low-quality meat sold cheaply. Larger meatpacking companies, like Armour, didn't appreciate having to compete with them. When Congress started discussing a new meat inspection law after the publication of The Jungle, the big meatpackers welcomed it. They hoped the smaller companies would find it too tough to comply with the law and be forced to go out of business. The law that Congress passed in 1906, the Meat Inspection Act, is usually seen as a victory for Roosevelt and Sinclair. In reality, it was a victory for the large meatpackers. Not only did it help drive the smaller companies out of business, the larger companies didn't even have to pay for the inspections. The federal government did. On the same day Roosevelt signed the Meat Inspection Act into law, he signed the Pure Food and Drug Act as well. This law required companies to list the ingredients in food and tell the truth about the effects of their medicines. Companies were putting cocaine and heroin in children's medications and lying about their effects. The Meat Inspection and Pure Food and Drug Acts were victories for progressives. They addressed a major issue for which they had been fighting for years: consumer protection. The idea of the consumer was brand new during the late 1800s. More and more people were living in cities rather than farms. This meant fewer and fewer people produced what they needed themselves and instead relied on purchasing them from elsewhere. There were more and more products to purchase too. Aside from food and medicine, there were toys, candy bars, soft drinks, fashionable clothes, and theater tickets. The first department stores opened at this time. Americans were consuming more than ever. And progressives didn't just want to ensure the quality of products, they wanted to ensure the quality of services. Progressives were behind the effort to ensure that doctors, dentists, and lawyers would be properly trained by requiring them to get state licenses. It was common before that for people without medical degrees to pose as doctors. Barbers usually doubled as dentists. It's why the chairs you sit in at the barber today are almost identical to the chairs you sit in at the dentist. The red and white pole you see outside of barbershops represents the blood that would cover your bib after your barber was done pulling your teeth. Was it just a coincidence that most progressives were also consumers? Was it a coincidence that professionalizing services ensured that people with middle-class educations would perform those services? Was it a coincidence that the wealthy classes also supported these efforts? It was certainly easier for progressives to get things done when the capitalist class also wanted to do them.